Hey, History Seeking here. Today we visit Richmond Castle in North Yorkshire, founded by Alan Rufus after William the Conqueror granted him lands as gifts around 1071, and perhaps the most complete 11th century survival of its kind in Europe. The Richmond 16 were imprisoned here in 1916, and the castle passed through several powerful owners, including the Crown until it fell into ruin in the 15th century and restored again in the 1850s. Richmond Castle is almost 1,000 years old. It was built by Alan Rufus, a cousin of William the Conqueror, shortly after the Norman invasion. The castle represented Alan's great power across the north, a reign that prone to rebellion and invasion. Alan ran his estates from Richmond Castle and kept an eye on Cumberland, which was under Scottish control. He probably also enhanced his political position through his relationship with Gunhild of Wessex. Alan Rufus, Lord of Richmond, was also called the Red because of his fiery hair or ruddy complexion. He was a cousin of William the Conqueror. Fiercely loyal to William, he benefited from several royal gifts of land. Alan was in a relationship with the Anglo-Saxon princess Gunhild of Wessex. Their union gave him the loyalty and support of families with links to Gunhild, but there is also evidence of genuine affection between Gunhild and Alan. Gunhild, Princess of Wessex, was the daughter of Edith Swanneck, a major landowner in eastern England, and Harold Godwinson, briefly King of England. Little about her early life is known, except that following the conquest, when she was being raised at Wilton Abbey, Wiltshire, a travelling bishop cured her of a diseased eye. Later, Gunhild left to live with Alan Rufus. Though she remained with Alan until her death in 1093, the relationship scandalised the church. She remained an important figure, even though the ruling Normans had killed her father. Before us is the cell block. Unfortunately, when we visited, there was no access. From the Norman conquest onwards, the greatest castles in England were dignified by huge stone towers, rectangular in plan and with massively thick walls. These buildings were intended as much as expressions of power and wealth as to serve any practical function. They were known in the 12th century as great towers. Richmond's Great Tower was probably built in the 1160s by Alan Rufus' cousin Conan, Duke of Brittany. The building rises to just over 100 feet, 30 metres, the benchmark height of a medieval skyscraper, and has 4 stories. The wall rises from a sloping plinth, with small windows, and at each corner of the battlemented parapet is a turret. The interior seems to have been designed for the formal reception of visitors rather than a residence, as there is no kitchen services. In the late 13th century, some alterations were made to the tower internally, and the present floors were added when the building was most recently restored in 1854 to 1855. The vaulting of the ground floor of the keep was added in the 13th century, probably by Edward I. The massive cellar pillar was designed to accommodate the well. On the first floor, the lighting from the north side of the room are 3 windows. The sills originally dropped almost to the floor, but they were built up in the 1850s. Externally, these windows are ornamented with columns, capitals and arches. These windows may have served the same purpose as the balconies of other 12th century keeps, which allowed the lord of the castle to appear before his people assembled in the marketplace below. The cut stone blocks that originally covered the internal walls of this space have in places been stripped away and replaced in the 1850s with coarse rubble masonry to either end of the larger interior as small vaulted rooms within the depths of the walls. Their function is unclear. This main chamber is a magnificent hall, rising to an open timber roof, a modern reconstruction. At each end of the hall are high windows, with sills stepped to allow more light to fall into the open space below. This splendid interior was presumably a space for formal gatherings and audiences. Its walls of cut stone give an impression of the overall quality of the keep when it was first built. There are 4 doorways on this floor. 2 are topped by arches and 2 are not. The 2 that not lead to small mural chambers that may have served as withdrawing spaces for privileged visitors. A notable feature of the keep is how architectural details signal use. Semicircle overarches occur only above doors that form part of the principal internal thoroughfare of the building. Originally, all such doors in the keep had these overarches. Doors to dead ends, for example, to latrines and mural chambers, have simple square heads. The second overarched door leads to the stairs to the roof. From outside, the progress of the stairways can be tracked in the regular distribution of narrow windows, following the angle of the stairs. This great room was the centre of power for the honour of Richmond and a gathering place for the most influential people. The rulers of Richmond Castle sat here as they oversaw their vast estate, hearing complaints, settling arguments, and giving gifts of land. The decoration of this space would be rich and splendid, featuring colourful tapestries with geometric patterns, mythical beasts or scenes from legends. The stone ledge in front of you represents the remains of a raised platform for a throne. The windows on the east wall are offset to provide the best light for scribes to read and write. The side rooms were probably used for storage. From the roof parapets, there are splendid views over the town and surrounding country. From here it is also possible to get a clear impression of the original arrangement of the roof. The timbers of the present structure, built in the 1850s and re-leaded in 1958, are inserted into the sockets of the original roof. They form a truncated gable. The original roof, by contrast, rose to a ridge beam, supported by a projecting block of stone at each end. These stones can be seen a little below the level of the walkway. The roof is countersunk, sitting within the top story of the tower, rather than being raised on the heads of the walls. A nearly universal form of roof amongst keeps in England. Above the roofline is the east wall, and there's a narrow window, its purpose a mystery. Diagonally opposite, it is a blocked doorway, reached from the stairway to the roof, which would have allowed access to service the gutters. Looking north to Richmond town, the town was laid out soon after the castle in the late 11th century, with homes and workshops clustered around the central market. The buildings have changed, but nearly 1,000 years later, you can still see the same outline. The cell block, built between about 1855 and 1857, this building is an important surviving remnant of Richmond's castle's renewal in the 19th century. having been abandoned for centuries. In the 1850s, the castle became the headquarters of the North York militia. It later served as the headquarters of the Northumbrian division of the Territorial Army and as a base for the northern companies of the non-combatant corps during the First World War. This was a military unit which supported the war efforts in roles that did not involve fighting or the use of arms. Scratched, scribbled and etched into the cell block's interior walls are thousands of graffiti drawn between the late 19th and 20th centuries. Delicate portraits of loved ones and pastoral scenes are set alongside bold political and religious statements. Biblical verse and hymns share wall space with regimental numbers and tallies for games. These offer tantalising glimpses of the thoughts and experiences of those who spent time in the cells. Over 2,300 graffiti have been catalogued in the cell block and tell an incredible range of stories. The best known graffiti was drawn in the First World War by conscientious objectors, men held in the cells for refusing to participate in the war efforts because of their religious, moral and political views. However, new research is uncovering the range of people who wrote on the walls. We are finding stories about battleships, beer bottles, nurses, Second World War soldiers and visitors to the castle. The castle became the headquarters of the Northumbrian division of the Territorial Army in 1908. The army officer and hero of the Boer War, and the later founder of the Boy Scouts, Robert Baden-Powell, from 1857 to 1941, commanded the division from 1908 to 1910. When Richmond, he lived in the Tower, the officers' quarters at the south end of the castle barracks. In 1910, part of the castle came into the guardianship of then Office of Works, and a campaign began to restore the buildings. Spoil from levelling the parade ground in front of the barracks had been piled against the eastern wall and was threatening to collapse. This was cleared and some medieval foundations were revealed in the process. Military fittings from the keep were stripped out and the walls of the building repaired and repointed. Throughout this work, the castle then remained in military occupation. Following the outbreak of the First World War, it became in May 1916 a base for the newly created Northern Non-Combatant Corps, some of whom were imprisoned in the cell block. The Victorian barracks were demolished in 1931 and the whole site was thereafter given into the care of the state. During the Second World War, the military again took over the castle. Temporary washhouses and latrines were built. The keep was used as an air raid shelter and its roof as a lookout. Again, the cell block was used as a prison, this time for regular soldiers undergoing punishment. To the left of us is the first tower along the east curtain wall, which is known as the Robin Hood Tower. As first built between 1071 and 1093, the tower rose only to the wallwalk, with two barrel vaulted chambers, set one above the other. The ground floor chamber was a chapel. The first floor chamber was restored in 1836, and in 1910 to 1911 its use is unknown. It was entered from a short passage within the depth of the curtain wall, above the original postern gate which has now vanished. Such wall or mural passages are a distinctive feature of grand Romanesque architecture and are seen in other 11th century English castle wall towers, such as those at Ludlow in Shropshire. In about the 1300s, a second floor was added at wallwalk level. It served as a lodging chamber. Its fireplace and a narrow window survive. At the same time, a walkway was jetted out behind the tower to allow people to pass along the wallwalk around the tower without having to go down to ground level. The stone brackets that supported the walkway are still visible, and in the grass beside the tower is a medieval well and the footings of a medieval building of uncertain date. The well was the source of water in the castle. It was expensive to build and maintain, but for an aristocratic household it was important to have a secluded well away from the bustle and dirt of the town. Well water is generally hygienic and safe for medieval consumption. Although wealthier people drank wine or ale, Over time, various objects fell into the well. These can help tell the story of the castle. When the castle was cleared in the early 20th century, the well was also emptied, though workers did not reach the bottom. Objects recovered from it provides a glimpse into the castle's life in the 14th and 15th century. Finds like jugs and urinal suggest that people who brought water and cleaned private chambers worked here and dropped the objects by accident. After this time, when occupation of the castle declined, the well was no longer used for water and it became a refuge pit. This later material was probably rubbish, but tells us a lot about lost interiors. This chapel is a rare example of an 11th century interior. It was dedicated to St. Nicholas. Around the three inner walls of the chapel run a stone bench and above it a series of arches that was once supported on columns. In this arrangement, quite common in castle design, each arch would have formed the canopy of a seat. A guide to the castle of 1821 noted that these seats were still divided by pilasters and formally ornated on the side with sketches of figures drawn with red paint, some of the colours appearing yet very fresh. Opposite the small central entrance is a window flanked by roundels. The altar stone on which Mass was celebrated filled the sill. A groove inside the window frame may have held a panel of stained glass, and the rectangular recess allowed the whole to be closed by a shutter. To either side of the window arch are small niches, perhaps intended for candles or lights. A similar arrangement can be seen in the 11th century altar niche at Hastings Castle in Sussex. In the window overarch are traces of crude red lines on a white background, perhaps the remains of underpainting that guided the artist in the final decorative scheme. It could date from the building of the chapel. The altar window is framed on the outside by a projecting panel of stone, a device used to highlight the position of the chapel. Along the east curtain wall were three square planned towers, one of which has collapsed. Several doors and openings survive in this stretch of the wall, evidence of buildings that would have lined it. This passage, like others along the curtain wall, led to a toilet inside the curtain wall. Its drain emptied on the other side of the wall. It dates to the late 11th century. Richmond's architecture has a mixture of Anglo-Saxon and Norman influences. Can you see any triangular headed doors to towers and latrines found in the curtain walls of Richmond? These are common in pre-Norman buildings across England, but are rarer in castles. building of this range is about 1300, may have been prompted by a fire, but such an expansion of the domestic apartments also reflect wider changes to lordly living, which required more and larger withdrawing chambers. Within the new range were these 3 ground rooms, the use of which is not known, and 3 first floor rooms above them. A doorway in the chamber over the cockpit entrance opened to the first of the rooms at first floor level. The great chamber, a second doorway knocked through a window at the east end of Scotland's Hall, would have also linked to the first floor chambers via an external gallery, to which stairs from the castle enclosure led up in line with the north wall of the chamber. Remains of the stairs can be seen in the ground. The great chamber is so identified in a survey of 1538. It was space for entertaining privileged guests. Beyond this was the chapel, the south wall of which preserves its holy water basin, and beside it a small internal window, or squint, opening onto the great chamber. The squint enabled those in the great chamber to follow chapel services. The line of the chapel floor and the sockets for the joists that supported it are clearly visible in the masonry. Beyond the chapel was a third chamber of uncertain function, known from the 1538 survey simply as the chapel chamber. Only one wall of this last structure survives. Clearly visible in the masonry are sockets for its floor timbers. Scotland's Hall was the heart of Richmond Castle. Feasting in halls was how the rich and powerful demonstrated influence and entertained visitors. As a multi-purpose gathering place, Scotland's Hall also served as a place of administration, political intrigue and legal proceedings. It was probably almost the most important space in the entire castle, and would have been richly decorated. In the undercroft of Scotland's Hall is a gateway to the cockpit. It lacks any sculptured decoration, evidence that it was regarded as a subsidiary entrance to the castle. Above the gateway may have been a timber gallery. Off the hall chamber, its sockets survive in the wall. Sockets possibly for a second lower gallery runs the length of the outer wall of the hall, overlooking the cliff. The name cockpit for this area probably followed its use for cockfighting, a widely popular sport from the 16th to the 18th centuries, and appears in a notebook of the 2nd Duke of Richmond, dated 1745. The original function of this area is not known. Projecting north from the hall chamber is the Goldhold Tower, so named from at least the 19th century, after a story of treasure found in a recess. The first floor access from the hall chamber contained latrines supported on an internal arch, the spring of which remain. They presumably drained into the outer ditch through an opening at the foot of the tower. A second floor was added during the works of 1300. This upper room, with its own fireplace, formed a lodging at the level of the wall walk, from which it was accessed. Its door, with a shouldered arch, remains high on the west face of the tower. The Goldhold Tower housed the private latrine of the castle owners. Its name came from a tradition that treasure was found in its foundations in the 19th century, but there is no evidence of this. Built soon after the curtain wall, was constructed in the late 11th century. Its position by the well-heated and bright solar, which is a main bedroom, offered comfort in a luxurious corner of the complex. In the late 13th or 14th century, a private apartment was built on top of the Goldhold Tower. It was only accessed from the curtain wall and may have housed a household official. Reconstruction of Scotland's Hall, shown during its archaeological peak in the 14th century, when it was upgraded with rich accommodation and a chapel. The hall at first floor level was heated by a fire and stone hearth set on the timber floor. This old-fashioned feature was probably retained over time to emphasise the ancient age of the building. Scotland's Hall has been known since at least 1400, and probably since the time of Scotland himself, the castle steward, after whom it was named. He died between 1146 and 1150, and was witness on charters for over 50 years, implying an unusually long life. The hall was a special charge of the steward, the place where the lord of the castle entertained and fed his household. It was on the first floor above an undercroft, a common arrangement in Norman and Anglo-Norman architecture. The sockets for its floor timbers are clearly visible. The entrance was in the north wall at the west end. Footings for the external stair that rose to this entrance are visible in the grass. The importance of the doorway is marked by flanking columns. Along both sides of the hall was a series of windows, those of the 11th century, most of which remain. Each comprised two lights, without permanent glazing, divided by a central column. The shallow recess around each may have held shutters or wooden frame panels, of glass or vellum, greased to render it translucent. During the works of around 1300, the windows at the east end were altered, that to the north made into a door to the new chapel and chamber range, and that to the south greatly enlarged to light the high end of the hall, where the table for the lord and his most important guests stood. These two buildings were built around 1100. They were the Buttery, where butts or barrels of beer, ale and wet goods were stored, and the pantry, where bread and dried goods were kept. We think the kitchen was nearby, possible on the area of ground that has since collapsed down the hill. Only senior professional servants, such as ushers, were allowed access to the buttery and pantry. Lower-ranking servants were supervised. The buttery, pantry and kitchen all had direct access to the first floor hall by stairs and passages through its western wall to get food from cook to table as soon as possible. On the south side of the enclosure, along the edge of the cliff, are the foundations of several medieval buildings. No more specific date is known for these buildings, nor anything of their function, with one exception somewhere in this area, probably towards the turret at the southwest corner, was the chapel known as the Greater Chapel, and alongside it the living quarters for its community of 6 chaplains, supplied by Eggleston Abbey, about 10 miles away. This foundation is first recorded in a grant dated 1278. The chapel and its adjoining buildings were recorded as being in decay in the 1538 survey. The roofs, walls and doors all needed repairing. The southwest corner turret and the raised archway further along the west curtain wall are features visible in early drawings of the castle, but both have been heavily restored. These may have originally formed the belfry and the west window of the Greater Chapel. In 1855, a barrack block was built along the full length of the west curtain wall for the then tenants of the castle, the North York militia. It was demolished in 1931, but its foundations in the lawn are visible in dry weather. This area housed a large chapel where prayers were said for the souls of the dead. In 1278, John II, Earl of Richmond and Duke of Brittany, requested that 6 canons should come from Eggleston Abbey to live at Richmond and pray for the soul of his late wife, Beatrice. John II gave enough land and money to pay for these services at the great chapel forever. The canons and their servants were given special permission by John to leave the castle if it was ever attacked. This is the southern western gate. This gate acted as the main supply route for the castle, near to the kitchen and storage buildings. The noise of traffic through this gate was kept away from the main living area in the eastern part of the castle. We hope you enjoyed the tour of Richmond Castle. Do take care and have a fantastic week ahead.